The folding chair tipped backward and clattered across the church basement linoleum, and nobody bent to pick it up. It just lay there on its side under the fluorescent lights, one leg still spinning, while 40 people pretended to study their paper plates. Macaroni salad, sliced ham going gray at the edges, a coffee urn that had been wheezing since noon. This was my grandfather's memorial in the basement of St. Columbkille's, and the woman who had knocked the chair over was my sister, standing up to make a toast. Not the sister I grew up sharing a bedroom with, not the girl who taught me to ride a bike on Asbury Road. The woman standing there in a boutique blazer she could no longer afford, lifting a paper cup of church coffee like it was champagne. To the daughter who actually stayed, Marlene said, and smiled at me when she said it. I didn't move. I sat straight in my chair, hands folded, the way I'd learned to sit a long time ago, and I let the insult land in the room and stay there. Before the coffee in those cups went cold, the woman they all pitied would be the only one left standing on solid ground, and the sister who laughed would learn exactly what her own signature had cost. I just didn't know it yet. None of us did. I want to tell you about Roy Vance, too, because he was in the doorway. A big man in a bailiff's uniform, holding his hat, who took one look at me across that basement and went pale as the tablecloth. But that comes later. 3 weeks earlier, before everything fell apart, I was just a county clerk in Dubuque, Iowa, and that was exactly how I liked it. My name is Cleo Kirby. I'm 47 years old, and for 9 years I have worked the recorder's window at the Dubuque County Courthouse, the limestone one downtown with the steps worn into shallow bowls. I file deeds. I record liens, plats, easements, the small paper bones of who owns what. People slide documents under the brass grill, and I read them the way other people read faces, carefully, all the way to the bottom. I came home to Iowa 11 years ago. I don't talk about where I was before that, and my family learned not to ask. They decided, somewhere along the way, that the silence meant there was nothing to tell. A woman who comes home quiet must be coming home from nothing. That was easier for everyone, so I let them have it. My grandfather, Errol Kirby, was the only one who never bought it. He died on a Tuesday in April at 86 in the farmhouse he'd lived in for 60 years, a weathered, clapboard place up on the bluff off Asbury Road, north edge of town, out past Cooler Valley, where the corn haze sits low in the mornings. He'd been a crop duster his whole working life. He flew biplanes 10 feet over the soybeans, close enough to count the leaves, and he taught me to fly before I was tall enough to see over the cowling. He taught me to read, too. Not books, records, maps, deeds, weather charts, the angle of a fence line. Land tells the truth if you know how to ask it, he used to say. He had a saying I never understood. Whenever I'd leave the farmhouse after Sunday dinner, he'd squeeze my shoulder at the door and say, "The crow always finds the nest." I thought it was just an old man's nonsense, a thing he said. I'd smile and say it back and drive down the bluff. I didn't know those words were already written down somewhere, in a document, with my name beside them, years before I'd earned the name at all. The morning of the memorial, I drove out to the farmhouse first, habit. The place sat empty now, the curtains still drawn the way the family had left them. There's a room upstairs my grandfather called his map room, at the end of the hall, behind a door he kept locked. Nobody had been in it since he died. The key was somewhere in his desk, the family figured, and nobody had gone looking because nobody thought there was anything in there but old charts and dust. I stood at the bottom of the stairs that morning and looked up at that closed door for a long minute. Then I left it alone and drove to the church. I should have known what kind of day it would be from the parking lot. Marlene's SUV was parked across 2 spaces, and through the windshield I could see folders on the passenger seat. Manila folders. Marlene doesn't carry folders to a funeral unless she's planning to use them. Marlene Kirby Frost is 51. She's my older sister, and she stayed in Dubuque her whole life, which she will tell you and tell you again. She married a man named Frost who sold insurance and then sold less of it, and she opened a boutique on Main Street that sells candles and throw pillows and dresses with the tags, still bearing the original New York prices. The store is dying. I knew that the way I know most things, quietly from the records. 2 mortgages now. A second one filed in March against her house. The kind of paper that smells like fear when it crosses my window. But you'd never know it from how she ran that basement. She greeted people at the foot of the stairs like it was her event. She steered the conversation, refilled the urn, accepted condolences as though grief were a thing she alone had earned. And when there was a lull, when 40 folding chairs had settled into that after-lunch quiet, she stood up and knocked her own chair over and made her toast. To the daughter who actually stayed, she said, "People smiled the way you smile when you're not sure." To the one who nursed Mom when she was sick, who didn't run off to who knows where. A small laugh, light, like she was telling a joke we were all in on. And to Cleo. She turned to me, still down at the courthouse stamping other people's lives. Still just a county clerk. She lifted the cup an inch higher. Somebody's got to do it, right? A few people laughed, the polite kind, the kind that dies fast. Then the room got quiet, and the quiet was worse, because the quiet meant they agreed. I looked at my sister, and I held her eyes a half-second longer than was comfortable. That's all. I've stood in worse rooms than that one. I've heard louder things said by men who outranked her in every way that counts, on nights when the floor was moving, and I did not raise my voice then either. So Marlene's little speech in a church basement did not move me the way she wanted it to. I picked the fallen chair up off the floor and set it on its feet. I sat back down. I said nothing. Mrs. Donna Pelletier, 2 seats down, reached over and patted my knee. She's the widow from the farm down the road, a small woman in her 70s with hands like dried apple. She didn't say anything either. She just patted my knee twice and looked at Marlene with something cool in her eyes that I filed away to think about later. I thought that was the end of it. I thought Marlene had gotten what she came for, the laugh, the room, the small public knife. I was wrong. She wasn't finished. She came around the table while people were starting to gather their coats, and she set a folded sheet of paper down in front of me on top of my untouched plate. "You should look at this before you hear it from somebody else," she said, quietly now. The performance was over. This was business. I've started the paperwork on the farm, the trust, the land, all of it. With Grandpa gone, somebody responsible needs to handle it. She smoothed the front of her blazer. "You're not exactly in a position to manage property, Cleo. You can barely manage to talk to people." I unfolded the paper. It was a copy of a quitclaim deed, filled out in Marlene's careful looping hand, naming herself as grantee of the Kirby land on the bluff. The 80 acres, the farmhouse, the map room, drawn up by a lawyer downtown, dated the week after our grandfather's funeral, waiting only to be recorded at my window, at the recorder's office where I worked. I read it twice, slowly, all the way to the bottom, the way I read everything. And here is the thing about reading documents for a living. You learn what a document is supposed to say. You learn the shape of a clean transfer, the way a doctor learns the shape of a healthy heartbeat. And this deed was wrong. Not forged exactly, just built on an assumption. It assumed the land was Marlene's to take. It assumed there was nothing standing in her way. You can't deed land out of a trust by just writing your name on it, I said. First words I'd spoken all afternoon. Marlene's smile flickered. "There is no trust, Cleo. There's a will. I've seen it. Everything splits between us, and I'm offering to handle the property side so you don't have to." She leaned down. "I'm doing you a favor. The way I see it, you owe me a few. I was here. You weren't." I folded the deed back along its creases and slid it into my coat pocket. I didn't argue. People like Marlene mistake quiet for agreement. It's a habit they keep right up until the moment it costs them everything. "All right," I said. She blinked. She'd braced for a fight and gotten a clerk filing a document. "All right," she repeated, suspicious, and then she straightened up and went back to being the hostess, and I sat with the folded deed warm in my pocket and thought about my grandfather, who had spent his whole life teaching me that land tells the truth if you know how to ask it. I drove home the long way that evening, out Asbury Road, past the bluff. The farmhouse stood dark against the last of the light, the river, somewhere below it, running cold the way the rivers up here always run cold, even in summer. I sat in my car at the bottom of the drive for a while. I thought about Marlene saying, "There is no trust." She'd said it the way she said everything, like saying it loudly enough made it so. But my grandfather had used a word once. We'd been at the kitchen table years back, and he'd had a beer and gone soft the way he sometimes did, and he'd said, "I took care of it, Cleo. The land. I set it up so nobody can ever put one of mine out of the nest. Put it in a trust long time ago. Wrote it careful." I'd half listened. I was younger then, and I thought I had nowhere to fall. "There's an envelope," he'd said, "in the lockbox, for the one who comes home flying." Then my grandmother had come in with the pie, and he'd never finished, and I'd never asked. A trust, long time ago, written careful. If a trust existed, it would be recorded. And recorded documents pass under one brass grill in this county, all day, every day, and I am the woman behind it. The next morning was a Saturday, but I have a key to the courthouse, and the records don't care what day it is. I let myself in through the side door off the alley, into that smell I know better than my own kitchen, old paper and floor wax, and the cold mineral breath of the limestone. The lights buzzed on one bank at a time down the long room. I sat down at the reading station in the back, the one nobody uses, and I started pulling the Kirby filings. Everyone. All the way back. It took me until the windows went gray with evening to find it, but I found it. A trust instrument, the Kirby Family Land Trust, recorded 31 years ago in my grandfather's own hand, predating any will my sister had ever seen by 3 decades. And I sat very still in that empty courthouse, because 31 years ago I was 16 years old. I had never flown anything but a crop duster on a summer afternoon, with my grandfather's hand over mine on the stick. I had not yet done any of the things that came later. I had no name but the one my parents gave me, so I could not explain then why my grandfather had written the word that was waiting for me near the bottom of that page. The word at the bottom of the page was 2 words, and they were typed, not written, set apart from my grandfather's looping hand in a line of cold legal print a lawyer must have put down for him, administered by the air known in service as Storm Crow. I read it the way you read a thing you don't believe. Once fast, to be sure I'd seen it. Once slow, with my finger under the line, the way I make members of the public do when they swear a document is theirs. Storm Crow. 2 words in a county filing recorded 31 years ago, on paper gone soft and yellow at the edges, with a recorder's stamp from a man who'd been dead 20 years bleeding faint in the corner. I did not have that name 31 years ago. Nobody did. It did not exist. It would not exist for another decade and more. And when it finally did exist, it was spoken by men in headsets over a valley a long way from Iowa, on a night I have spent the rest of my life not talking about. My grandfather never flew anything with a radio in it. He flew a yellow biplane over soybeans and waved at the men on the combines. He had no way to know those words. He had no business knowing them. And yet there they were, in his trust, in his county, waiting at my window for a woman who hadn't earned them yet. I sat in that empty courthouse until the radiators ticked cold and the limestone gave up the last of the day's warmth, and I could not make the arithmetic come out. A man cannot write down a name that hasn't been given. That is not how time runs. I am not a woman who believes in signs or omens or the soft comforts people reach for at funerals. I believe in records. Records are the one honest thing left, because paper does not care how you feel about it. And the record in my hands said something impossible, in my grandfather's own filing, and the only person who could explain it had been laid in the ground off Asbury Road 6 weeks back. I made a copy. I'm a clerk. Copies are what I do. I folded it next to Marlene's deed in my coat pocket. those two papers riding home together against my chest, the false one and the true one, and I drove out the long way past the bluff again without quite deciding to. Monday, the courthouse opened and I was at my window at 8 sharp because the records don't care what kind of weekend you've had, and neither does the public. I recorded a satisfaction of mortgage for a young couple who held hands the whole time. I recorded a plat for a developer who didn't look at me once. And a little after 10, while I was reading a lien all the way to the bottom the way I do, a shadow filled the doorway at the end of the hall, and a man's voice that I had not heard in 15 years said one word, and that word was not my name. Crow. I looked up. He stood in the courthouse hallway in a bailiff's uniform, big across the shoulders the way he'd always been, gone gray at the temples now and heavier through the middle, holding his uniform hat in both hands the way you'd hold something in church. Roy Vance, Chief Warrant Officer Roy Vance, who had been the crew chief on my bird, who had patched her up after that night with his own hands and his own swearing, who had stood on the tarmac at the end of it all and not been able to look at me because neither of us could. 15 years. He had gone the color of the courthouse plaster. All the blood dropped out of his face, and his hands had stopped on the brim of his hat. Roy, I said. I heard a Kirby work the recorder's window, he said. His voice wasn't steady. Town this size, you hear things. I told myself it was a cousin. I told myself for 2 years it was a cousin. He took a step into the room and stopped, like the floor might not hold. It's you. My God, it's you, and you've been down here stamping deeds, and nobody in this building knows they got Stormcrow filing their paperwork. The room had 3 other people in it, a title searcher at the long table, a man waiting on a form, and Marlene. I hadn't seen her come in. She'd come to deliver her deed in person. Of course she had. To watch me stamp it, to have that too. She stood near the counter with the folded quitclaim in her hand and a small ready smile on her face, the smile she'd worn in the basement. And I watched that smile come apart slow as Roy Vance kept talking, because Roy could not stop now that he'd started. The ridge, he said. You remember the ridge? Of course you remember the ridge. 2 birds went in to bring those people off that ridge, and the weather closed, and Command called it. Command called it scrubbed, and you keyed up and said you were going anyway. He was almost smiling, that terrible shaking smile a man gets when something he buried comes up whole. Took 2 hits on the way out. I counted the holes after. I put my fingers in them. Bird should not have flown, and you flew it home, and the last thing that came over the net before you set her down was the major calling your sign. Bring them home, Stormcrow. Bring them home. He stopped. His eyes were wet, and he didn't care. You brought them home. The title searcher had turned around in her chair. The man with the form had lowered it, and Marlene stood by my counter with her mouth slightly open and her deed forgotten in her hand, looking at her little sister behind the brass grill as if she had never seen me before in her life. That's not, Marlene started. She stopped. She gave a small laugh, the basement laugh, but it came out wrong, thin. Cleo's a clerk. She files things. Roy, I don't know what you think you. With respect, ma'am, Roy Vance said, and he said the word respect the way you'd lay something heavy down very carefully. I don't think you know who your sister is at all. I had not said a word through any of it. That is the discipline. And the discipline is the only thing I came home with that still fits. I sat straight, hands folded on the counter, and I held my sister's eyes a half-second longer than was comfortable.
Thank you.
And I watched the thing happen in her face that I had waited 30 years to see and took no pleasure in at all. The faces in the room had changed. That's the part Marlene felt before she understood it. The faces had changed, and they were not looking at the clerk anymore. Roy, I said quietly, it's good to see you. Come find me when I close up. We'll talk. He nodded, fast, swiping at his face with the back of one hand, and he put his hat back on and went. And the room was very quiet, and Marlene laid her deed on my counter without a word and did not ask me to stamp it. She picked it back up. She put it in her bag. She left. I recorded 3 more documents before lunch with my hands perfectly steady, because that is the job, and the job is what holds me. But I could not stop hearing it. Storm Crow, in Roy's broken voice in the hallway. Storm Crow, in cold type at the bottom of a trust, filed when I was 16 years old and had never been anything but a farm girl with a grandfather who let her hold the stick. The same 2 words, 15 years and 200 miles and one impossible stretch of time apart, and no way under heaven for the second one to have caused the first. He couldn't have known. That was the wall I kept walking into. He could not have known the name, unless the name had never been the point. Unless my grandfather, all those years ago, sitting with some downtown lawyer and a beer soft heart, had not been writing down a thing I would become. He had been writing down a thing he already saw. The crow always finds the nest. He'd set it at the door every Sunday of my life, his hand on my shoulder, and I'd thought it was an old man's nonsense, and it had been a key the whole time, and I'd carried it home in my pocket without knowing the shape of the lock. There was an envelope, he'd said, in the lockbox. For the one who comes home flying. I closed the window at 4:30. I did not wait for Roy. I sent word with the deputy that I'd find him tomorrow. I drove out Asbury Road with the corn haze going gold and low over the fields, and the river a cold gray thread down below the bluff. And I parked at the top of the drive at the dark farmhouse, and this time I did not sit in the car. I went up the porch steps my grandfather built. I let myself in with the key the family kept under the loose board he thought nobody knew about, and I went up the stairs to the end of the hall, to the map room, the locked one, the one nobody had opened since the day he died because they all believed there was nothing in it but charts and dust. The key for it was in his desk, 3rd drawer, under a tin of pipe tobacco gone hard, exactly where a man like him would put a thing he wanted, found by someone willing to look. It turned stiff in the lock. The door swung in on that held breath of a room that's been shut a long time, dust and old paper and machine oil, and underneath it all the faint ghost of his pipe. I found the light, and I stood in the doorway a long moment because the walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in the maps of his life. Sectional charts gone brown, a photograph of the yellow biplane, soil surveys, weather charts, a hand-drawn map of every field he'd ever dusted with the dangerous corners marked in red pencil. And against the far wall, under a sheet, square and patient, something the size of a small suitcase on a folding metal stand. I pulled the sheet off. It was a projector, an old reel-to-reel film projector, the kind they used to thread by hand, oiled and dusted and pointed at a bare patch of white wall like he'd set it up and tested it and covered it and waited. And on the table beside it, in a row, sat a stack of flat round tins, the dull dented aluminum kind, and the top one had a strip of masking tape across the lid, and on the tape in my grandfather's hand, in pencil, it said, "For Cleo, when she's ready." My hands were not steady anymore. I sat down in his chair in front of that wall of maps, and I picked up the top tin, and I worked the lid loose with my thumbs the way you'd open something you were half afraid of. And inside, wound tight and dark on its spool, was a reel of film. There was no label on the reel itself. There didn't need to be. I knew the size of the gun camera tins. I had seen them stacked in 1,000 briefing rooms a lifetime ago. I just had never once imagined holding one in a farmhouse on a bluff off Asbury Road in the quiet north end of Dubuque, with my grandfather 6 weeks in the ground and the corn going dark outside the window. I sat there a long time with the cold weight of it in my lap, not yet threading it, not yet ready to see what a dead man in Iowa had somehow saved for me. And I understood, sitting there, that the impossible name in the trust and the impossible reel in my hands were the same question asked twice. and that the answer to both of them was waiting on that bare white wall as soon as I found the courage to switch the lamp on and let it play. I reached for the end of the film. And then I made myself stop, because that is the discipline too. You do not rush the thing you have waited your whole life to see. You check your instruments first. You set your hands. So I sat in my grandfather's chair in that map room off Asbury Road with the corn going black outside the window, and I did what he taught me to do with my hands before he ever taught me to do it with an aircraft. I threaded the film slow, over the front sprocket, down through the gate, around the take-up reel, the way I'd watched men do it in briefing rooms a lifetime and a world away, the way he must have practiced alone up here in the dark so he could leave it ready for me. The leader caught. The spool took. I found the switch on the side of the lamp housing, cold metal under my thumb, and I sat there one more second in the quiet, and then I turned it on. The lamp threw a square of white onto the bare wall, dust turning slow in the beam. There was a stutter, a run of scratched leader, numbers counting down out of order, and then the wall was not a wall anymore. It was sky. Gray, boiling, low, the kind of weather that closes a valley like a hand, and across the bottom edge of the frame, the dark line of a ridge I had not let myself look at in 15 years. There was no sound but the projector ticking, and that was almost worse because my body filled the silence in for me. I knew the sound that went with that picture. I had it in my back teeth. The film shuddered, and the horizon tilted hard, the way a horizon tilts when you put a heavy aircraft over on its side and ask it for everything it has, and I watched the gun camera see what I had seen, the ridge swinging up, the gray coming down, the world gone to water on the glass. Then the first hit. You don't hear it on a silent reel. You see it. The frame jumps. A white flash blooms off the left of the picture and is gone, and the whole image shivers like a struck bell. And then, a few feet of film later, the second. Closer. The camera kicks and the horizon drops away entirely, and for a long, sick stretch, there is nothing in the frame but cloud, just gray. Nothing. The bird falling through it, the rotor somewhere overhead screaming a note I could feel in the fillings of my teeth, though the film made no sound at all. I had my hand over my mouth. I did not remember putting it there. And then the nose came up. On the wall, in my grandfather's dark map room, the gray broke and the ridge swung back down into frame where it belonged, lower now, falling behind, and the horizon steadied, wobbling, wounded but level. She flew. 2 hits and a screaming rotor and a valley that command had called shut, and she came off that ridge and she leveled and she flew, and the last few feet of film ran out into white, and the tail of the reel slapped around and around on the take-up spool, slap, slap, slap in the dark. I sat there and let it slap until it wound down on its own. There had been words on the radio that night. The film could not give them to me, but I did not need it to, because Roy Vance had already stood in my courthouse hallway and handed them back to me in his broken voice. Bring them home, Storm Crow. Bring them home. I had. That was the thing I never told a soul in this town. I had brought them home. All but one. And a person who brings everyone home but one does not get to keep the noise that comes after. That was the arithmetic I had done that night, and every night since, and it had always come out the same. And it was the truest reason I had spent 15 years making myself small enough to fit behind a brass grill where nobody would ever clap. I turned the lamp off. The room went back to being a room. And I understood, sitting in the dark with the smell of his pipe still in the walls, that my grandfather had known. Not the details, not the ridge, but the shape of me. He had watched a 16-year-old hold the stick over a soybean field and not flinch when the field jumped up at her. And somewhere in his slow, careful heart, he had decided what I was before I had the first idea myself. And he had spent the rest of his life making sure that whatever I became, however far I flew, there would be a nest I could not be put out of. The crow always finds the nest. He had not been talking about birds. I did not sleep at the farmhouse. I drove back into town under a sky with no weather in it for once, the lights of Dubuque coming up cold along the river, and I let myself into my own small house, and I sat at my own kitchen table until morning with two things in front of me: Marlene's folded deed, the false one, and the copy of the trust, the true one. And between them, on the table where I'd dropped my keys, my own key ring, the one I'd carried for 20 years, with the little worn brass key on it that I had told every locksmith and every co-worker and my own self opened nothing important. A filing cabinet, I'd say. Old one. Lost the cabinet years ago. Just never took the key off. I had never once tried it in a lock and asked it the truth. In the morning, I did not go straight to my window. I made 2 stops first because the records had given me 2 names I could not leave alone. And the engine that drives me is not anger. It never has been. It is the need to read a thing all the way to the bottom. The first name was Donna Pelletier, who lived down the road from the bluff in a tidy white house with a flag holder by the door and no flag in it. I knew her a little, the way you know everyone in a town like this. I knew her husband had not come home from his own war a long time ago. What I had found in the records, going back through my grandfather's filings the same night I found the trust, was a satisfaction of mortgage on the Pelletier place, paid in full, recorded quiet, with no name on the paying end but a trust account I now knew the shape of. I sat in her kitchen and drank coffee I didn't want, and when I asked her, gentle, she got up and stood at the sink with her back to me, a while before she could answer. "Your grandfather," she said finally, "told me a church group did it. An anonymous one. He looked me right in the eye and lied to my face so I wouldn't have to feel beholden." She laughed, wet. Errol Kirby. I buried that man's secret for 11 years because I thought it was a church. It was him. It was just him the whole time, wasn't it? "It was just him," I said. The second name was younger. Theo Vance, a mechanic out at the field where they keep the small planes, a serious kid with grease in the creases of his hands, and it took me 10 minutes of talking to him by an open cowling before I understood whose nephew he was, and another 10 before he told me, careful, watching my face, that his apprenticeship and his airframe school had been covered by a scholarship he'd never been able to find the bottom of, a fund set up years back for a local kid who wanted to work on aircraft. He didn't know who. I did. I stood in that hangar with the smell of oil and cold metal, and I thought, Roy's nephew. And I knew with a cold, clean certainty that my grandfather had not stumbled into that one. He had reached across 15 years and 200 miles and found the family of the man who patched my bird, and he had quietly put a wing under the boy, and he had told no one. He provided for everyone he loved, and he loved more people than any of us had the eyes to see. I drove downtown with my jaw set and my hands easy on the wheel, because I understood now what the brass key was for, and I understood that I had been carrying the answer to all of it on the same ring as my house and my courthouse door for 20 years, jingling in my pocket every single day. I told my sister I was nobody. Dubuque Bank and Trust sits on Main Street in a square stone building older than the state, and the safe deposit room is down a stair behind a steel gate, cold the way the courthouse limestone is cold, that mineral underground cold that doesn't care what season it is up above. I had thought about it on the drive, and I had nearly talked myself out of it twice, because if I was wrong, if the key opened nothing, then I was just a clerk after all, and the impossible name in the trust was a coincidence or a kindness, and the real was only an old man's grief. And I could go back to my window and stamp deeds until I died, and nobody would be the wiser. But I am not built to leave a record unread. He made sure of that. The young man at the desk asked for the box number, and I didn't have one, and I almost turned around. Then I gave him the only number I had. The trust number off the courthouse filing, the long string I'd copied in my own hand in that empty records room on a Saturday, and his face did something, and he went into the back and he came out with a thin gray ledger, and his manner had changed entirely. "Miss Kirby," he said, and there was a care in it now. "This box has standing instructions on it. It's been here a long time. It's only to be opened by a co-holder named on the original card, and there's a note that the bank's to verify the holders." "Huh." He looked at the ledger and then at me. "Service record. It says service record. I've honestly never seen one set up like this." "I imagine not," I said. He brought the box card, and there at the bottom, beside my grandfather Errol Kirby's looping signature, in the line for the second holder, was a single line of cold type that some lawyer had set down for him decades ago. The same cold type from the trust, the same 2 words, waiting in a stone basement on Main Street through every year I spent pretending they had nothing to do with me. The holder of the key, administered by the heir known in service as Storm Crow. The young man looked at the card and then at me, and he was too polite to ask, and I was done being small in front of polite people who didn't know what they were looking at. I took my key ring out of my coat pocket. I found the little worn brass key by feel, the way I'd found 100 switches in the dark, and I held it up between us in the cold underground light so we could both see the thing I'd told everyone opened a filing cabinet. "You'll want to bring the box to a private room," I said, and my voice was steady, the way it stays steady when everything underneath it is not. "And there's something else you should know before you do, son, because it's going to matter to this bank by the end of the week. There's a second mortgage filed against the land that secures this trust. Filed recent. Filed by a Marlene Kirby Frost." I watched him write the name. "I'm the county recorder. I'd like you to note the date and time I told you, because the instrument she signed to take that loan is about to become a very interesting piece of paper." He led me down the row of steel doors to a small room with a single table and a single lamp, and he set the long gray box down in front of me, and he stepped out, and he closed the door, and it was just me and the cold and the box and the worn brass key my grandfather had cut for a woman who did not exist yet on the day he had it made. I set the key in the lock. It fit the way a thing fits when it was always going to. The lid came up on oiled hinges, quiet as a held breath. Inside, the box was nearly empty, and that emptiness told me more than a stack of papers ever could, because a man who fills a vault with everything is hiding nothing in particular, and a man who leaves only what matters has spent a long time deciding. There was a slim folder of legal pages, the original trust on heavy stock gone the color of weak tea at the edges. There was a smaller envelope of cash, not a fortune, the kind of money you leave so the person you love does not have to ask anyone for bus fare on the worst day of her life. And there was a sealed manila envelope, soft from handling, the flap pressed down by a thumb that had pressed it more than once over the years. And across the front in pencil, in that same patient slanted hand from the lid of the film tin, it read, "For the one who comes home flying." I had told the young man at the desk that I read records all the way to the bottom because I am built that way. This was the bottom. I knew it the way you know the last ridge before home, even when the instruments argue with you. I slid my finger under the flap, careful of the brittle glue, and I drew the pages out into that cold underground light, and I made myself read them in order, the way he would have wanted, the way he taught me to walk a chart before I ever touched a throttle. The trust was dated the spring I turned 11. I read that line 3 times. The spring I turned 11, a girl who had never sat in any cockpit, who had spent that whole green season in the back 40 of the Bluff place, learning from a crop duster how to hold a stick level over a soybean field while the field tried to come up and meet her. He had drawn the trust that same season. And on the 3rd page, in the recital where a lawyer lays out who gets what and why, in dry, cold type a stranger had set for him decades before any of it came true, it named the successor trustee. Not by my legal name, by the name a radio would give me in weather over a closed valley 15 years into a future he could not have seen, the air known in service as Storm Crow. You have probably already guessed how he could have known. You have not, because the truth was smaller and stranger than prophecy. I read the clause under it, the explanatory clause, the one his lawyer must have argued against and lost, and there in plain words my grandfather had written the answer himself. He wrote that he had watched the child fly before she had wings, that a crop duster knows the shape of a flyer, the way he knows weather coming up the Mississippi, and that whatever name the service one day hung on her, she would always be the same thing she was at 11 over that bean field, a crow. His word, chosen on purpose, the bird that goes up alone into bad sky and comes back to the same branch every single time. He had not predicted my call sign. He had described me so exactly that when a stranger in a flight suit needed a word for what I did over that ridge, the word was already waiting, because the men who name you only ever read out loud the thing that was true about you the whole time. The crow always finds the nest. He had not been speaking about birds, and he had not been speaking in riddles. He had been telling me, years early, in the only way a private man knows how, that there was no version of me that he had not already loved and made room for. I sat in that stone basement and I did not perform anything because there was no one to perform for, and I let the thing come up through me that I had refused to let come up in a church basement full of neighbors with their eyes on their plates. Then I put the pages back in order and I closed the box and I went to do the part he had built me to do. The lawyer's name was Ardith Sunda, an old hand who had kept her office 2 blocks off Main since before I left town. And when I laid the original trust on her table beside the certified copy of Marlene's filing, she went quiet the way careful people go quiet when they see the whole shape of a thing at once. She read it twice. She is built a little the way I am. Then she set them side by side and walked me through it in layers, her finger moving down the page, and each layer closed a door I had not known I was standing in the draft of. The trust predated the will. That was the first layer, and by itself it was enough, because you cannot leave in a will what a trust already holds. The land off Asbury Road had not been our grandfather's to give away at the end, because he had given it to itself years before, to be held for the family in a structure no single heir could crack open and sell. Marlene's whole claim, the folded deed she had slid across the linoleum like a closing argument, rested on a will that governed nothing that mattered. The second layer was the one that took the breath out of the room, though the only people in the room were Ardith, Sunda, and me. There was a clause, and Ardith read it aloud, that any heir who brought a competing claim against the trust land, any heir who filed paper to pull the land out from under the family, removed themselves from it entirely. Drank their own cup is the country way to say it. My grandfather, drafting in the spring I turned 11, had foreseen not the ridge and not the weather, but the kitchen, the oldest weather there is, and he had written a door that locked itself the instant someone tried to force it. Marlene had filed her instrument at the county recorder's office on a Tuesday in spring. The clause did not care that she was drowning. The clause did not care that she had nursed our mother while I was a world away. And I want to be honest that this part of it was true, and that I have never once pretended it wasn't. It only read what she had signed, and what she had signed had cost her the very thing she signed it to take. The third layer named the successor, verified by service record, and the fourth layer was a single line directing the trustee to release a sealed reel to the department for an honor it said had been long delayed. And Ardith looked up from that line and asked me, plainly, what the reel was. I told her it was already played. I told her I had threaded it on his projector in the map room 2 nights before and watched the bird take 2 hits and come off a closed ridge level, and that the radio that night had called a name, and that the name was the one typed in her hand on the page in front of her. She made the calls a clerk's granddaughter would make. That is the part nobody puts in the story, the part that is only paper and telephones, but it is the part that holds. By the end of that week, the county recorder, which is to say my own office, the brass grill I had hidden behind for 15 years, froze Marlene's filing as a clouded instrument pending review and referred the manner of its signing to the county attorney. Dubuque Bank and Trust, the same stone building with the cold basement, reversed the second mortgage that had been written against trust land it never legally touched, which meant the loan that was supposed to save Marlene's failing boutique evaporated, and also meant the land could never be sold out from under a single soul who carried our name. He had not just protected me. He had built a thing that protected the next one. And the next, a girl not yet born who might someday come home flying or come home crawling and find the branch still there. The honor came on a gray Saturday, the kind of low sky that closes a valley, and there is a hard justice in that I did not ask for. They held it at the field out past Cooler Valley where they keep the small planes, in the same hangar that smelled of oil and cold metal, where Theo Vance had told me about a scholarship he could never find the bottom of. They set up a screen. They threaded the reel, a department man doing it with white gloves and getting it wrong twice before I stepped forward without a word and threaded it the way my grandfather had left it ready, over the front sprocket, down through the gate, around the take-up, my hands remembering for me. 4 of them had come, retired, all of them, grayer than the men I'd flown for, 2 using canes, 1 I half recognized from a briefing in another country in another life. Generals. They had come for a crop duster's granddaughter on a delayed citation that the paper said should have been read 15 years before and never was, because the woman it belonged to had asked, in writing, in her own hand, that it be filed and forgotten. Roy Vance was there in his bailiff's coat, off duty, standing at the side with his nephew, and when the reel ran and the ridge swung up and the frame jumped white with the first hit and then the second, Roy did not look at the screen. He looked at me. He had been there in the noise. He did not need the picture. And Marlene was there. I had asked Ardith to make sure she was invited, not summoned, invited, and I had not known until the door opened whether she would come. She came. She stood at the back in a good coat that I now understood she could no longer afford, and she watched the silent film show the thing her sister had done and never once mentioned across 15 years of being called just a clerk, and I watched her face come apart in the dark very quietly, the way a thing comes apart when it has been holding too much weight for too long. The reel ran out into white. The oldest of the 4, the one with 2 canes, did not give a speech, and I was grateful, because I have never been able to bear this speech. He simply came to the front, slow, and he straightened himself with effort against everything his body had to say about it, and he brought his hand up, and the other 3 came up beside him and did the same. 4 old men in a cold hangar in Iowa, holding a salute for the name on the screen, and the name was mine. I stood at attention and I held it, and I did not let my face do anything, because that is the discipline, and the discipline is the only way I have ever found to carry the thing without dropping it. I will tell you the last true thing now, the one I never told this town, because it is the only thing that explains why I spent 15 years making myself small enough to disappear behind a window. I brought them home. Off that ridge, through that weather command had called shut, 2 hits and a rotor screaming a note I still feel in my teeth. I brought them home. All of them, but 1. And a person who comes home 1 short does not feel she has earned a single hand brought up to a brow, does not feel she can stand in a hangar and let 4 old men spend their bodies saluting her, because every clap and every salute sounds, to her, exactly like the one voice that did not make it back. So she files the citation and asks them to forget it. She takes the loud thing she did and she folds it down small and she slides it behind a brass grill, and she stamps other people's deeds, and when her own sister laughs and calls her nobody, she lets it stand, because in the arithmetic she does every night, it is almost a relief to be called the thing she's been trying to become. My grandfather knew that about me too. He must have. It is why he did not leave me a medal in that box. He left me a branch. Afterward, in the gravel lot with the planes tied down against the wind, Marlene came to me. She had nothing left to raise a cup with, and we both knew it. The boutique gone, the mortgage undone, the filing referred to people who ask hard questions. She started to say something about back pay, about staying, about mother, the old account she had kept for so long, and I did not let her finish. Not out of cruelty, the other thing. I told her the Bluff place had room. I told her the farmhouse off Asbury Road had stood empty since he went into the ground, and that a house like that goes bad if no one breathes in it through the winters, and that she could take the east rooms that catch the morning, and that no one would ever file a paper to put her out, because I had read the clause to the bottom, and the clause did not work that way for family who simply needed a place to be. She looked at me like she was waiting for the second half, the part where I made her pay for the linoleum and the laugh. There wasn't one. He had not built me to collect. I went up to the map room alone the next morning. The framed clause had been hanging on that bare white wall the entire time. The whole time I was hunting for it in basements and ledgers, matted and set behind glass at eye level beside his charts, in plain sight of anyone who climbed the stairs, which is to say, in plain sight of no one, because we none of us ever climbed them. I had taken it down to carry to Ardith. Now I hung it back exactly where his nail still waited, square and level, the way he'd want it. Then I drove into town. My niece is 9. She keeps a little ring of keys she has collected the way children do. Keys to nothing. Keys that feel like something. I took the worn brass key off my own ring, the one I had carried 20 years, and told every soul opened a filing cabinet. And I worked the split ring open with my thumbnail, and I slid it onto hers among the keys to nothing. Except this one opened the box on Main Street, and one day she would learn that, and one day after that she would write a clause of her own. I had already started it. A girl who comes home. It begins, however she comes. She turned the new key over in the light and asked me what it opened. I told her she'd know when she was ready. The crow watches the nest now.